Hello everyone, and welcome back to You Need This Book in Your Life, the weekly YouTube book review show presented by the nerdy kid with the glasses from every classroom in the world. This week I am going to be talking about Rutger Bregman's book Utopia for Realists. Now, I have noticed, as I've been doing this for a few weeks now, that my style does tend to get quite passionate when I'm talking about things that I really care about, and it may get a little bit over the top this week. When I first read Utopia for Realists, I genuinely had to stop about halfway through because there were some days where the difference between the lived experience of reality and the world that Bregman quite credibly was painting a picture of was so different it was too much to take on my drive into work. And why is that, you might ask? Well, Utopia for Realists is a book predicated on the idea that we as society now are in this kind of late stage, bloated, we've got everything we want and it's not interesting anymore, and we live in this state of meh, I don't care. You know, imagine the lad on the Fatboy Slim album cover with the "I'm number one, so why try harder" t-shirt. We're bored of our existence. We've achieved everything that needed to be achieved for centuries and millennia, and here we are going, right, well, that's it then. And it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to exist in this world where the next little improvement that we're looking for is a slightly better black screen to look at, or an extra percentage point on GDP. There is so much more that can be had than that. Now, yeah, again, I'm talking woolly and inspiring, optimistic stuff, but there is a very credible academic thinking behind all of this. What Bregman talks about is three things: universal basic income, a 15-hour work week, and open borders. And let me address those in turn. Universal basic income, for those of you who haven't heard about it before, think about it as free money given to everyone to ensure that nobody starves and everyone can have an acceptable standard of living. A baseline requirement for participating in society and ensuring you don't starve to death on the street. Now, the natural reaction, certainly living in Britain in the 21st century, you get to the idea of any money being handed out by the government is either A, I don't like the idea of someone getting something they're not entitled to, or B, normally there would be some really seamless editing around this time, but my kids kind of interrupted in the middle of the video, so I'm going to have to stop and start again. Now, I believe I was talking about universal basic income. Now, there are two usual responses that you get from the British public in the 21st century about the idea of money being handed out by the government. One, I hate the idea that someone might get something they're not entitled to, or two, how are we going to pay for that? Well, Bregman's got an answer for both of these. Now, the first question is, this resentful, bitter, I don't like the idea that people might get something they're not entitled to. Everyone's entitled to it. That's the point of a universal basic income. You don't like someone else getting it? So what? You get it too. They're not anywhere further ahead than you. You want to be better off in work? Great, fine. They are better off in work. People will remain better off in work because work is then money that you earn on top of your universal basic income. And what does the world of work look like under a system where your employer doesn't effectively have the whip of hunger at your back? Well, think about it this way. If you're in a workplace where you feel oppressed by your employer, or under the jackboot, or you're a woman who's being harassed, or you're being bullied by your colleagues, or the workplace culture is toxic, you can leave and not starve. If there are things that you would like to do with your life that don't revolve around the arguably relatively pointless thing that you do in a workplace for 37.5 hours a week, universal basic income would allow you the intellectual headroom to know that you can survive if you wanted to take, a couple of weeks out to do something that is actually fulfilling. Universal basic income basically means that your priorities in life are no longer around what have I got to do to avoid starving, what have I got to do to avoid starving, what have I got to do to avoid starving. They can become about doing things that you actually want to do and that you actually enjoy in life. And from there, Bregman leads us on. In fact, no, I'm going to dial it back a little bit because there's loads more interesting stuff on UBI. Now, this sounds like a pipe dream, this idea that, oh, right, okay, so the government will give you free money and everything's fine. Well, no, not quite. It's been trialled. Universal basic income experiments have been trialled in Canada. Even Richard Nixon was within a whisker of passing a universal basic income in America. And we all know that kind of vampiric, cadaverous villain that Richard Nixon is in the popular imagination. Even in Britain, it was done in the city of London with a cluster of homeless guys. And each of them was given free money to do as they see fit, because it was identified that they as individuals were costing the government a significant amount of money in mental health provision and policing and medical fees. Giving them their own money with no strings attached. They didn't go out and spend it on heroin. They didn't go out and spend it on booze. What they invested it in was the things that had value for them individually, and it bettered them. We're talking about really basic stuff like access to allotments or gardening causes, something that would give you some sense of there being a meaning to life, something which would be useful. And I think that brings me back onto the second point that normally gets pushed back on. How are we going to pay for this? Well, we're paying for a lack of universal basic income now. People who are too stressed to work because they go to work in a job that they hate because they have to avoid starvation. Their costs need to be paid, whether it's in addiction treatment or whether it's in mental health, healthcare provision from a GP, whether it's through lost time. Other ways in which we have to pay for this. Yeah, if you have substance addiction issues, then you're in a position where you interact with either homelessness services or policing. All of those cost money. The whole logic of austerity and trying to keep the public purse as tight as possible is ludicrous. It's the logic of refusing to mend the leak in the roof and then it's the logic of refusing to mend the leak because you can't be bothered to pay for the leak fix, and then waiting until the ceiling caves in and handing over a bill for the ceiling caving in. That's the logic of not having a universal basic income. These costs are already being incurred by society now. I think I'll get off my soapbox a little bit in terms of universal basic income and then go on to the 15-hour work week. Now, this one really gets me as well. Because as Bregman says, I think the statistic that he brings around is 37% of people believe their jobs to be fundamentally pointless. That is to say, it really doesn't matter what you do. I mean, if you are, for example, a farmer or a nurse or a fireman or a midwife, a teacher, even garbage collection, as the example that Bregman uses, if you do one of those jobs, you are useful to society. People's quality of life is improved by your presence in it. However, if you do a job, as many of us do, which amounts to little more than moving the score of wealth very slightly from company A over to company B, that's not, in your soul, you know that's not helpful. You may, it may give you a better position in the overall rat race treadmill, but it's not fundamentally valuable either to you or the universe. A lot of us know that. And even if you don't, the amount of work that we have to do is killing us anyway. And there is no additional benefit to be had in killing yourself for 60 hours a week, whether you enjoy your job or not. The human brain is not equipped to do it. So what Bregman advocates for is a 15-hour work week. Again, if you loathe your job or if your job isn't fulfilling, that probably sounds idyllic, but we're not just talking about using the remaining time to go home and sit on the sofa and watch Netflix. That's what our leisure time looks like now, because we don't have any other time on our hands to do it. By the time you get home and having done this, by the time you get home from having worked 60 hours a week, you tend to find that all you've got the mental and physical capacity to do is sit in front of the sofa and watch Netflix. Well, if you had far more time in the week, you may find that you could write novels or paint poetry or take up paint poetry. You see what I mean there? Or take up carpentry or do something which is the thing that you were doing before some villain came along and said you had to abandon it in order to make a living. So it's really about having more enriching leisure time. Now, can society support this? Yes, society can support this. It's been proven. I think the overall, during the 3-day week earlier in British society prior to my birth, I think during the Ted Heath government, the 3-day week reduced work output of the country by 6%. So it's not massive. The idea is that you just crowbar more usefulness into the time you have, rather than sitting there dead-eyed for several hours a day, clicking the mouse over and over again, keeping a seat warm as if that's the value that you add to the company and to the world. It's not. Again, stepping down off the soapbox for the third thing, which is open borders. Now, this is probably the most arguably controversial or utopian in the book, but what Bregman advocates for is a world in which borders are open and people can come and go as they please. This is something that you see within the European Union, where labour can move freely. It boosts countries' economies to have labour readily available where it's needed, rather than investment by the state being in doing this kind of Priti Patel style, let's pay for gunboats to sink the dinghies, you know, rather than wasting money on building gigantic walls that don't work, just move the labour to where it's required. And yes, I'm aware there are, the cowardly euphemism is cultural problems with doing that. And Bregman doesn't advocate for an immediate, let's throw all the borders in the bin now and abandon the concept of a passport. Like the other two, it's a goal that he would talk about working towards. But again, the sort of academic evidence that Bregman draws on is that this stuff will actually work. It will make you materially richer and culturally richer to do it. So I would invite you, reflecting on these three things, universal basic income, 15-hour work week and open borders, to reflect on the fact that, as Bregman says, we live in utopia now. Pretty much every utopian ideal that previous generations over centuries would come across looks not too dissimilar from what our lives are. I'm standing a quarter of a mile from a supermarket where I can wander across the road and buy affordably food from all over the planet, and that isn't unusual to me. If, you know, my great 10 times great grandfather was here, he'd probably have been quite grateful for enough turnips to eat to prevent his family starving to death. That's how far society has come. And what Bregman's talking about is taking the next step and making our society something which is even more pleasant to be part of. Now, if that sounds like something you're interested in or you'd like to learn more about, then as always, I've popped a purchase link for Waterstones in the description to this video if you want to go and pick up a copy. I would invite you to read it, get evangelical about it. As I always say, bang on to your leaders and demand this stuff, because it's important and it would make a difference to everyone's quality of life. But for my own selfish reasons, I would invite you, as always, to forget that I was going to say that and let me dial back to the bit where I go, do you need this book in your life? Well, I think it's abundantly clear that you do from everything that I've said. So now I'll skip back to the bit where I say, leave a like on this video if you've enjoyed it. If you've liked my passionate rant and you'd like to see more, then subscribe. If there's something you would like me to read, then the offer, my reading desk is always open. Let me know in the comments and I'll pick up a copy on Audible, and then I'll give the audio book a listen, and maybe I'll the next thing I'll review will be, or one of the next things I review will be something that's lit your fire. Again, I would ask, as I love the exposure, share this on your social media, and I will see you next week, where I will be reviewing David Baddiel's excellent but short book, Jews Don't Count. So I will see you next Sunday at 8 PM, everyone. Cheers. Bye.